So communicating climate change through storytelling. Abby, I'm going to ask you, do you mind starting our first poll? We're going to start with a poll just to sort of take the temperature of the room, if you will. And the poll is about why stories. Why do you want to use storytelling to communicate climate change? And if you don't know, you can just pick one that you think might be the way your body's telling you might be the way forward for you. I know on my screen, they're very, very small to read, but they say, I want to persuade others to act on climate change. I want to better understand my own commitment and call to action on climate change. And I want to be able to see the world I want to live in or other.
All right, pretty much everyone has voted, so I'm going to stop now.
Okay, thank you, Abby. And can you share the results with everyone? All right, so pretty much everybody responded, and we have a pretty obvious majority here. Most people want to persuade others to act on climate change, which what gives you? I thought this was like building bridges of coalitions and we're listening to each other. I thought that was like the opposite of what we're here to do today, but I'm with y'all. I can gear this towards that. But I made this poll really as a way of showcasing some of the different roles that stories can hold in movements, grassroots organizing, and our lives. We can use stories to persuade others, to learn and educate others. We can use stories to deepen our own understanding of self and our commitment and to our values, what matters to us as individuals or as collectives, as organizations, as communities. And then, and often neglected, but my particular favorite function of stories is the ability of stories to envision a different world. You can't be what you can't see. And when it comes to transitioning to a green economy, a just sustainable future, well, that's something we don't know what it looks like yet. And places like stories and art and organizing are one of those locations, social locations that we form that ability to see what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. So let me close off that poll. Peter asked, I wonder how to use fiction to make a climate changed and a renewable energy world and make it real. Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. And we'll sort of, as we go through this, we'll try to see how on our goals here, how thinking about stories and climate change together can be really fruitful for our work, whatever that work might be. I'm very confident in saying that. So our goals of our workshop are going to be to gain climate story insight, not just what's it mean to tell a climate story, but what's it mean to think narratively, think about climate stories. And of course, we're going to practice telling stories. You can't do anything unless you practice it, right? So that's going to be a big part of our workshop today. And then we'll end by introducing some additional resources and pathways, not to be like too cheesy in climate change with this, but this is of course just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much you can do in terms of getting into the work of storytelling and climate change. And for all of you who registered for this workshop in particular and who got my email earlier today, I'll be able to email you out essentially a PDF with tons of links to free online resources for you to further your work in this. If you did not register for the workshop and arrived in the workshop, you can send a private chat to Abby, Abby P, and she will be able to collate the whole list together at the end and make sure that you get that resource, because I can't attach it in Zoom because it's too many hyperlinks involved in that. So again, feel free to drop questions in the chat or use the raise hand function at any time to sort of slow us down. I'm a college professor, so I end up like talking a lot and talking fast, and I just go, and I really rely on people to like stop me and make me slow down or make me repeat myself when I'm not being clear or just, not speaking clearly. I'm also in need of coffee, sir. So I have not only a small coffee, but I also ran across campus and got a large coffee as a backup for when I need it. Yeah, and you can of course always email me at sdhall@salisbury.edu. All right, so I like quotes. I think quotes can be super powerful. They're pregnant with possibilities of different ways of reading them, different ways of understanding them and applying them in our own life. And this is one of my favorites right now, at least. The currency of story is not truth, but meaning. And that's from Doyle Canning and Patrick Rinesborough, two folks who founded a storytelling organizing group using stories to understand and win grassroots change for social justice initiatives. So the currency of story is not truth, but meaning. That can be a frustrating idea for some of us, I think, especially in a time where it seems like, frankly, fiction has overrun reality, or we don't seem to have agreed upon realities anymore. The idea that, stories sort of beat out reality for airtime more often than not is really frustrating. It frustrates me too. But the fact remains that stories are compelling and powerful precisely because they are rich in meaning. And so we need to learn to use that power wisely and not poorly. So let me ask y'all, and I will take a couple comments verbally if you want, or you can put your answer in the chat. If we want to think about a good story like a stew or a soup, I'm thinking something nice and warm because it is cold where I live right now, and Salisbury right now is very cold. And so I want like a hearty stew along with my coffee today. What ingredients make up a good story stew? What makes that stew nourishing and flavorful? So maybe let's all take 30 seconds to think about that. Maybe if you can, pop something in the chat or use that raise hand function and we'll call on you and see what good ingredients or elements make up a good story. Hallie, do you mind helping me call out some of these excellent contributions here? There are so many so fast, it's hard to keep up.
Happy to, Shane. Thank you. There are no raised hands, so everyone's writing in, and that means we have a lot of these. So we started with empathy and optimism from Peter. Ren said details and specifics. Thurandi said engagement. Sarah said beginning, middle, end, and a few great characters. Matthew said relatability, representation, depth. Alyssa said conveying personal experiences with the subject. Cliff, life events that we can all relate to. Dan, believable characters, vivid descriptions. Maya Bar, a climax. Sarah, another Sarah, characters. Chris, emotional connection. Again, characters from Cheryl. Bill, relevant to my situation. Sarah, growth. Kian, a message. Peter, tension of plot. Jeff, change within a character. Chris, being genuine. Sophia, conflict resolution. Brenda, personal touches. Judy, a revelation as the story unfolds. There's the part of a climax. And Sarah, again, vivid language. So there's a novel's worth of ideas there.
I like that. I like the novel's worth. Thank you. Okay, so that's a whole lot really fast on stories, but this is good. This gets our creative juices flowing, I think, to think about it in terms of what do you got to throw into the pot? How are you going to cook up a good story? It's got to have some of these things. Maybe not all these things, but some of these things. I like the diversity of the kinds of responses in terms of some are really structural, right? Like they need to have a climax or a plot or characters. And others are more like those, again, in my food metaphor, like the seasoning that really draws out these structural elements like relevancy, emotional connection, tension, genuine, the idea of authenticity. There are those again, like what it is versus what it does kind of stuff when it comes to stories. And I want us to think about those. But I also want us to get practicing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some breakout rooms. I've already done this, Abby. I wanted to take that off your plate for a minute. And so I'm gonna have everybody enter a breakout room just in a minute, and it'll just be two of you in the breakout room. And what I'd like you to do is to tell a first story, and I'll put the prompt here in the chat, which is that I want you to say, how did you?
We've got it.
What? Sorry.
It's in there, Shane.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you, Callie.
You bet.
Yeah, so Kelly put it in there. How did you first get involved in the climate movement? How did you first get involved in the climate movement? Think about that however you want. Maybe it was a particular event, maybe it was a moment, maybe it was a gradual thing, but we're going to just give you 4 minutes in your breakout room, so roughly 2 minutes per person, to share your coming into the climate movement. And that is the first story we're going to practice telling. How did that go? Bill raised their hand.
Okay, I just want to say it went very well. I talked to Emma and about her career in EPA, and it was very interesting.
Cool, very interesting. It went well. Good. Anybody else want to report out? You have to, I think, raise your physical hand or a digital hand because we have to unmute you manually.
Peggy raised her hand, Shane.
Okay.
Hi, my partner was Serendi, and she's a lovely freshman at a Maryland college. And she and I kind of had similar stories. We both have, her dad was involved in the environment, and she grew up around a lot of environmental talk, and she began to see that as an important way of life. And in my case, my son is a climatologist.
Mm.
I told her I want to be like him when I get big.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of family connection there that sort of drew you all together. So let me get some more systemic responses from y'all with another poll. Abby, do you mind firing up our second poll? And this one has 2 questions. So once you answer the first, you can scroll down on the second one. The first question is, how did you feel telling your first climate story, your story of how you came into the climate movement? Give you a couple of options there. Other is an option. And secondly, did you find the stories of those in your group interesting and important? And the options there are, yes, I found those stories interesting and important. I want to hear more. Or yeah, I found those stories interesting and important, but they pretty much covered everything that there was to say about that. Or I found the stories somewhat interesting and important, and I didn't hear interesting and important stories. Leave the poll open maybe another 15 seconds or so. This one's a longer one.
I'm gonna close it now because pretty much everyone has voted.
Yep. All right, and you're sharing our results. Great. So look at that. So empowered, 7. That's 27% of y'all. Self-conscious, a few of you. Excited, a few of you. Awkward, only 2 of you. All the above, 4 of you. And other. Can I have those of you who selected other, or if those of you selected something else have additional ways that you were feeling about it, you want to throw those in the chat. I'd love to sort of capture what some of those other responses is. Emma says, wonderful speaking with Bill Allen. I was inspired by his decades of work trying to brighten the future for every generation. That's very nice. Others. But interestingly, or at least interesting to me, is in the second question, despite a lot of you feeling, on the one hand, empowered, but it seems like the emotions are sort of all over the place, right? You're a little nervous, you're a little self-conscious, empowered, excited, inspired. It's that good and that maybe good and bad to oversimplify that. virtually everybody said that not only did they find the stories interesting, but that they wanted to hear more. And of course, like, you know, you're at a CCL event called Building Bridges to Coalitions, like nobody's going to be mean and says that they're uninteresting stories. So in that sense, you can like fault the survey style. That's fair. But in my experience as a climate activist, and my experience as a teacher, and my experience just as a regular human being, we are just interested in people's stories. We are interested in one another on an individual level across political, social, religious, and other kinds of social differences that often are seen as the things that divide us. We actually find our identities things that we often just want to know about our life experiences a lot. And so that story you tell about how you come into a climate movement, however you define that movement, whether you're you define that as all the different ways that we have for that, a climate justice organizer, someone fighting for green jobs, someone working to fix the economy, whatever your word for what you do is, that story of you is a part of that and is a really important part of that. Yeah, so we got rid of that. And by and large, it sometimes can feel, when you're in like a lobbying situation or when you're talking, it can feel really vulnerable to tell that personal story. And you also feel like, or at least, again, a lot of folks I talk to in workshops like this or in classes that I teach feel like, well, the issue, or many issues around climate change are so important and so big and so grand. Like my story isn't particularly important when I talk about it. Let's get to the, the fee and dividend project. Let's get to the carbon tax. Let's get to the, COP26. But your story is the thing that often is what is going to open the door and open the ears and hearts and minds of other people who may not already be in the same space or fighting for the same things as you are. So that story is really important. And again, yes, it was a crummy survey question, but it shows that even amongst people who are more or less moving in the same direction, those stories are really interesting and intriguing to y'all. So I think it's important to foreground that front and center in our work today. Let me go back to my slides here. So we were talking about the ingredients for a good story, what makes it nourishing and flavorful. And it is just as simple as a lot of the things that y'all dropped into the chat. It's about having a character in a setting that then there's a plot, and the plot is always a moment of decision making. It's a conflict. It's I could go this way, or this is a challenge that I'm facing, and then how did you respond to it? That's really just about every story across many different cultures and times and places boil down to those very basic elements. And yet we find them just endlessly nourishing to our lives to hear stories, whether they're through our faith communities, through our entertainment, song, dance, our own sort of like daydreaming and fantasies, or things as deliberate and robust as a 500-page novel. We love stories, even though they're the same basic formula time and time and time again, because you can put endless little seasonings and flares and changing the order, changing the emphasis, changing the tone. And so, again, it sounds very like it is very simple. And yet it's something that takes a whole lot of work and time and experimentation to do well and do consistently well to get the results you want. And again, that's why I like the food metaphor for stories, because it's very much like cooking. You can, all cooking involves things that are edible, usually heated up in some way, shape, or form, and then they nourish you. Good. But there's a whole lot that can go wrong and a whole lot that can go right, and endless variation that ultimately you learn best by practicing day in and day out, moving in genres, just moving in, styles of food. Some flavors go well together, some don't. You can study the science behind it, or you can just be a true artist in the kitchen. Same with storytelling. We can approach it from a lot of different perspectives. Stories work like what they do is that they engage our emotions, our values, and our morals. That's something that it has to be at the heart of every story that you're going to tell. Stories are not just X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened. That's just reportage. That's just writing down what happened. Stories are stories because they elicit some kind of emotional response. And they therefore tap into our values, our beliefs, our morals, our ethics. And because they have that endless variety in them, they are inventive and can be educational, but they're also experiential often. We identify with characters, we identify with problems, even if the problems in the characters are incredibly different than ourselves. Often this in like actual, fine art literature makes for some really interesting reads when you have characters who are complex and certainly aren't perfect, and certainly you may not want to identify with, and you're reading them and you're like, and I still identify with them. That's sort of the radical empathic capacity of good stories, is that they pull you in whether you want them to or not, and try to see something from a different perspective, sometimes multiple perspectives. And we can apply the same kind of value of stories, not just in terms of literature, or not just in terms of movies or TV shows, but again, the kinds of communication you're doing in your work in the climate movement, whether that work is within your organization, if you're having a meeting or a conference, or whether that's in your work building your base or mobilizing your community, or arguing for what a solution to a problem should be. And so I want us to focus on this capacity of stories to help us rearrange and see the world a different way. I want us to keep that up there. It doesn't often feel like the most important thing in storytelling, but it is, I think, at the back of everything we're going to practice here, the greater good of stories and climate movement are. Marshall Gans, who was happy to hear referenced multiple times in the plenary panel this morning as a tremendous organizer who really focuses on the power of stories. And I'm very much borrowing a lot of resources from Gans's tremendous record of work in teaching people how to tell stories in grassroots movements. Marshall Gans says that movements have narratives. They tell stories because they are not just about rearranging economics and politics. They are also rearranging meaning. They're not just about redistributing the goods, they're about figuring out what is good. And so if I click, can I click back? If I click back real quick, again, it's it's not just about the underlying issues and things, it's about those morals and values and ethics, and being able to redefine what is good, what is right, what is wrong, what is realistic, what is unrealistic. And Marshall Gans talks about the importance of what he calls the story of self in that work. That is precisely the story that you just practiced telling, that story of how you are called to leadership, called to action. And that's very similar to what climate justice activist Jamie Margolin calls the why of being an activist. And I can't recommend this book enough. I'm teaching it right now in one of my classes, and Jamie Margolin at age 20, one of the co-founders of Zero Hour, begins her book, Youth to Power, which is a instruction manual on how to become a climate organizer, a youth climate organizer. It starts with this question of why. Why are you called to this movement? Why are you called to this moment? And these are questions on the screen now that she writes in there, and I added a couple on my own for the purposes of this workshop. But that is your calling. And in her book, Margolin writes that that why doesn't really change. It's the thing that keeps bringing you back time and again. Like, it's not about shutting down a pipeline, or it's not about passing a piece of legislation. Those are the small goals that get you to the bigger why, the why you're called into it, why you're putting your precious time and energy and attention and love and stress and frustration into a movement, is this deeper why. And it has to do with your values and your commitments and the people and places that you love. And that's a tremendously powerful thing to be able to communicate to another human being, because when people can see that kind of commitment and see that kind of value of the climate movement in your life, they're more likely to see you as one, a full-fledged human being, not just as a representative for a particular cause. And that's a part of opening those bridges for broader dialogues and deeper, broader coalitions, because people will recognize, oh, those values are also my values. I share those values. Let's do something together. Or let me listen to you more. But it's also this really important part about just understanding yourself, right? Like, I think some of us can get torn into shreds by being pulled in so many different directions in the world, so many different commitments, so much to do. It's good to know where you really value, where your community has values too. You can do this at a broader level, what Gans calls the story of us. But let's focus on that story of self right now. And to do that, I want to give you some time to write this story and to think about it in terms of, again, a story. And to review, a story has characters, it has a plot, and that plot is defined by a crisis, conflict, or point of decision. Callie, I didn't give you a warning on this, so feel free to turn me down on this, but you told, when we had our tech run, you told a really compelling story about lobbying I believe it was a member of Congress who was not in favor of what you were doing, but you told a story about why you were there instead of something else in your life, and that stuck with that congressperson, like more than anything else in the meeting. Do you mind? Can you tell us that
Oh,
story there?
thank you, Shane. Always happy to tell my story. This one was just that we had a very disengaged congressional aide we were meeting with in an office that wasn't particularly interested in our proposed bill. And I happened to mention that I was in Washington during the weekend of my daughter's graduation from high school, because this was what our family had agreed was the more important place for me to be. And at the end of a desultory meeting, as I left, he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you had to miss your daughter's graduation. Thank you for coming." And that seemed to be what resonated with him. Ironically, my daughter's graduation was in a heat wave back home, and people were very unhappy to be there. So that was when I realized it's okay sometimes to talk about yourself, even though we try to keep to the main topic. Thank you.
Yeah. Why I wanted to call, and I thank you so much for sharing that story, Callie. Why I wanted you to tell that then or now in the course of this workshop is that it beautifully demonstrates that moment of decision in Callie's story to why she's involved in the movement, right? She had a decision about what she could be doing that day, and to see your daughter's high school graduation is a tremendously proud and meaningful moment in any parent's life, and anybody, whether or not you have kids or anything, can recognize that and see the value in that. And so even if you have no concept of what Callie thinks is important about any of this climate stuff, the fact that she chose to do that in that particular moment speaks to its power. And clearly from the representative's reaction to it, like even a sheepish apology for still not budging from their views on it is showing how the power of that personal choice to draw that person in, and I'm sure draw all of us in. When I heard her tell that story, I was like, whoa, like that's commitment right there. Like that's like an authentic commitment that is infectious, is something that you want to learn more about, something you want to respect more. So those moments of choice, those moments of conflict, what do you do? Why did you have to keep going instead of quitting and leaving, or take the harder path instead of the easier path maybe, or take the path that you did versus another opportunity? Those are all those conflict moments, those choice moments, those challenge moments in a story, and they can be very important when you're making that inner story a public story, like Callie did in that particular lobbying meeting. So what I want to do is, it is 4:12 right now. I want to give us at least 8 minutes or so, and then maybe check back in, where I invite you to just, you're already muted, but mute your camera if you haven't turned your camera off already. And I just want you to try to write on a piece of paper or type on a whatever word processing thing you want to do, or sketch if you're a visual person. And I want you to think about this story of self. Why are you doing this? Why are you joining a movement? Why are you starting a movement? Why are you fighting for change? Whatever of these questions elicits some response for you, lean into it and just try it. And think about those elements of a story. All right, so you told your story of self once without sort of us talking about what a story of self was. And now we've had some time to rethink that using Jamie Margolin and Marshall Gann's prompts to sort of help us in that process. So of course, now the next step is to practice yet again. So Callie's going to open up some breakout rooms here in just a second, where you'll be, this time we're going to put you in groups of 3, and we'll give you the next like 10 minutes to tell your stories to one another. And you'll get some instructions in the chat as well about thinking, if you're in the listening position, I want you to practice active listening. To the best of your ability. Don't think about your story that's going to come. You have your little script in your notes. Really try to focus in on what they're saying, and try to think about what's the sort of the thing that's going to stick with you most. Like, chances are, if you don't know the folks in the room, you're going to forget their name very quickly, or at least I will. I'm terrible with names, but there's going to be something about their story. I will bet, $100 that there's something that you're going to remember 72 hours, 96 hours from now about this story. So think about what that thing is, and what about that thing makes it so sticky. All right, so without further ado, good luck on your next storytelling adventure, folks. I'm curious just to get some reactions from the group. What was it like telling this story sort of the second time around with a little bit of prep time and some guiding questions to get you into that genre? I know for some of you, this is probably something you've done in multiple different kinds of activities with CCL or other organizations. For others of you, this might have been your first or second time telling a story like this, or thinking about this kind of a story with that kind of the framing that we're using on it. So good, bad, and ugly. Either raise your hand and we can unmute you, or put something in the chat and we'll monitor the chat. Reflection is the way we solidify things. Emma has her hand raised, if we can unmute her.
Unmute. There we go.
And
go ahead, Emma.
Andy afterwards.
So personally, I found that it was not only more comfortable to have that prep time as someone who doesn't regularly talk about my involvement in environment, but to also hear from the other person's perspective what they had to add now that they had the chance to talk for a longer period of time and they had the chance to talk about more details. It was really powerful to hear not just their overarching mission statement or, the elevator speech, which was meaningful from the beginning. It was absolutely genuine the first time I heard it, but to hear the second time and start hearing about what drove them and their overall life experience behind that was really powerful.
Can we unmute Threndi too?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi.
Oh.
I felt like definitely the prep time really helped because it helped me and my partner kind of like get more thought into what we were going to say, and it helped us almost build off of what we were talking about earlier in the previous breakout session. So we found out that we have almost a very similar way of thinking about the issue of climate change and just environmental issues in general. We have like a pretty similar standpoint, and that's their religion, because we both believe that we have a moral obligation to take care of what God has created. So that was just really interesting, and I think the prep time definitely helped. So yeah.
Yeah, often the deeper we go and the closer to our values, those are the things that other people are also likely to share, or at least have their own version of that thing. And religious faith is one of those core values for so many of us. Catherine Hayhoe often drives that home in her climate change communication workshops and her work on it, that if you need to find a value to connect and find that common ground, it's often like a pretty good bet to go to faith, because a lot of folks have it in one way, shape, or form. Even those of us who don't ascribe to any religious faith have deep-seated like secular humanist values that are usually align with those major religions. And so, yeah, like that's a wonderful way to do that. Janet has also raised her hand, and then two different Sarahs in the chat room have said that they need to, one Sarah says need to work on the story, and sorry, we cut you off mid-sentence in the breakout sessions. That's Zoom, right? But also heard some tears happened in the rooms, and that is a sign of goodness, right? Like our body's reaction, our emotions reaction are the first and deepest way that we learn things and we feel things. We like to sometimes say that we're rational, logically driven robot humans, but that's just not true. That's never been true of human beings. We are deep-seated in feeling. So the fact that there's some waterworks going, that is healthy and good, and showing that you're getting those values, at least to yourself, totally there. And I bet to the person listening to you as well. Janet, do you want to?
I wanted to say thank you. I thought this was a good exercise, because I know personally I'm not the best storyteller, and I need to practice more, because I found I was at times a little bit all over the place. It could flow smoother. So this is a good start to work on this more. And I want to say thank you.
Oh. Thank you, Janet. Janet brings up a really important point here, and there's a reason why we did this sort of once through quick and once through with some prep, and that is that practice makes perfect. If you notice, for those of you who were in the plenary panel earlier today, there were some really powerful stories that the different panelists gave us, right? Yeah, I see people's heads nodding right away. And I heard at one point, there was a very telling comment, I forget who said it, but they're like, oh, that was so beautiful, Sam. And every time I hear that story, like it brings it back to me, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yep, that's a story that he has practiced and delivered time and time again. And there's a reason why that story was so good. And it's because there was practice. There was thought about how to order it. It comes off as perfectly authentic because it is perfectly authentic. It's an experience. The meaning of it is the same, but it can't hurt to polish it. Can't hurt to be really good at your instrument, really good at your sport, really good at whatever that activity you practice. Storytelling is exactly that. It's something that we get good at, and we practice our good stories. Just like when you're sitting around maybe a Thanksgiving dinner table and you tell one of those same family stories that's get told over and over and over and over again, it gets better with every telling because you have that practice and that inventiveness, that shared history. So there's nothing wrong in practicing your story of self a lot en route to that. All right, so let's see. I truthfully forget what my next slide is on here, but I'm going to go to it. Okay, so we worked on our short story of self, and we revisited that. We've been pausing. I've just been forgetting about my slides here altogether. And again, I have the word feeling on a lot of my slides because again, it's the emotions that matter. It's the emotions that we respond to and hold with us and stick in our minds more than the content of specific stories. So it's important to lean into those emotions. Thanks for that, y'all. I want to look at what I think is a really good story of self that I got because my team reminded me of this excellent new book, another book I will share in the resources, but this is All You Can Save, Truth, Courage, and the Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson. And one of the first pieces in there is by a young climate justice activist named Shea Bastida. And Shea writes one of the first chapters called Calling in this book. And I thought the first two paragraphs of her contribution are just an exemplary climate story, another kind of climate story that I want to focus our remaining minutes sort of on. So I'll just read her story, and it's up on the screen for y'all. I was raised in a small town called San Pedro Toltepec, outside of Toluca, a city in the basin that neighbors Mexico City. Between 2011 and 2013, my town experienced the worst drought in Mexico in 70 years. Then in 2015, we were hit by heavy rainfall that resulted in flooding, affecting worst the poor communities by the Lerma River. This was the first time I saw the effects of our climate crisis and how unjust they are. When my family and I later moved to New York City, I saw what Superstorm Sandy had done to Long Island and the seashore, and I thought, it's all the same problem. And so here we have another personal narrative, an autobiographical story that is not only telling the story of self, but also tapping into Bastida's larger stories, the stories of us and the stories of now. And these are also phrases that Marshall Gans has sort of introduced to the organizing world, and they transcend any kind of political platform or where you're coming from. They're just useful ways of mobilizing people to do something. So we've been spending our time on the story of self, because I think that's a really important one. It's one that you can continue to work on by yourself long after this workshop. But the story of now and the story of us are stories that you can tell by participating with groups like CCL, or other climate groups, whether it's Sunrise or Fridays for the Future, or whatever group you're tied into, right? But those are the sort of, when you link all three together, that's when you get really powerful appeals and persuasive appeals to climate action or any kind of action. Because you're not only talking about your call to leadership, your call to respond to your deep-seated values, but how the values of the community or the community we're building together are going to do there. How do we build a just, livable future for all? Those are our values, not just my value at that point, right? And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to get out the vote, pass this legislation, do this, do that, whatever that thing is, right? That's the campaign and the strategy. And you know, I am not in a campaign and strategy, so I don't have anything to like drop for you there, but that's exactly what your organizations are always doing, right? They're forming, what are those campaigns we need to do to bring about that change. So we're not going to dive into those. We don't have time, but that's just, there's, in the resources I'm going to share with you, there are links to a nice like 15-page sort of run through. You can do sort of your own workshop on thinking about the story of now, the story of us. But in my not so much time remaining, I want to give you 15 plus years of social science and humanities research, the cutting edge stuff, in less than 15 minutes now. And I'm really drawing heavily, I keep holding up books because I'm in my office, and anybody who ever takes class with me, I do this all the time. Normally I do it in real life, but Zoom's cool. This is a fantastic book if you have the time for it, also on the list, but Creative Climate Communications, Productive Pathways for Science, Policy, and Society by Maxwell Boykoff. It was published just a year or so ago. And it really is a synthesis of like the best state of knowledge in terms of what different scholarly fields like cognitive neuroscience, psychology, communications, rhetoric, literature, what folks in those fields are saying about climate change communication. And his rules for the road that Boykoff gives in his sort of final chapter, he tries to really sum all the other sum up chapters together, is, you know, some very basic communication things. First and foremost is be authentic to your values, your needs, your voice. You know, if you're a snarky person, you're not going to be the inspiring, like really even-handed like be snarky. Like that's you, like lean into it. If you're not snarky, don't be snarky, or, you know, play with being snarky on your own time. Be aware of your audience's values, needs, and goals. How can you connect with that? Again, religion is one that research shows is an excellent one for engaging people. People care about their faith. People care about their families. People care about their health. And so these are things that you can tie in at different ways. Be accurate to the underlying issues. You know, it's important, especially when there's so much disinformation and denial that's well-funded and well-organized. it helps to be accurate. Doesn't mean you need to be a climatologist to tell a climate story. In fact, you aren't necessarily going to be any better than anybody else. You might be actively worse if you're a climatologist at telling climate stories, but that's on the by and by. We can use these things. Be inventive and be bold, right? And those things really go together. Can you be, we all know basic stories, but we love stories that break the mold. We love unexpected characters, complicated characters, different kinds of sequencing of events. We love tension. We love the unexpected. So use that. So those are the rules of the road, right? But then there are also strategies. So how do you put those rules of the road into practice? Use these strategies. The first one I've heard a lot today already, and I hear often at CCL. It's sort of, I think, one of your biggest, it's an organization's one of the motivating things, which is to find common ground and meet people where they are on climate change. And sometimes that means never talking about climate change at all. Maybe it's about talking about things that matter in that community without ever using those words. I'm on the eastern shore of Maryland. Waterman communities and communities that live in Dorchester County and Wycomico and Somerset County oftentimes don't really want to talk about sea level rise or may not even believe in sea level rise or climate change, but they do want to talk about erosion, which is made worse by sea level rise. And we can talk about a lot of policies that will make us help us better adapt to erosion and rising seas without ever using the words climate change. And oftentimes that'll get you a lot further in a conversation. Somewhat, I go and pull my hair out afterwards a lot of times, but in terms of actually moving a conversation forward and finding shared values and commitments, we can do that. Those other ones are emphasizing climate impacts here and now, emphasizing as opposed to really far away and distant. It's yes, the sixth great mass extinction is a very important issue, but maybe compared to losing my home to erosion and sea level rise, not the most compelling for this particular moment. So emphasizing things here and now and then connecting them to things later and larger systems, that's sort of the road that a lot of social science research says gets people to do climate action. But then also, and this is the biggest one, I think, in terms of the history of the climate movement, at least as long as I've been involved with it, it's really easy to fall into doom and gloom narratives, those declining narratives where back in the day, everything was wonderful, we've polluted, we've destroyed, no matter what we do, things are still going to get worse. And so let's make them a little bit less worse. That's not a compelling argument. That's not a happy ending. We like stories with happy endings. And climate change does pose so many opportunities for us to engage and build a better world, a just world, a sustainable world. And so we need to emphasize how engaging in climate change can help people improve their lives, improve their livelihoods, and empower them to actually do that. And on a big scale, that might mean looking at, larger legislation and imagining what a green energy economy would look like. What are those green jobs? But it can also be smaller. Sometimes I hear climate stories a lot of students who get involved in activism at a college, and they say I got involved in this because I wanted to feel like I was a part of something larger and that I was helping my community. And I went from feeling really powerless to feeling like I have some of my best friends in the world alongside me as we, help out this community garden, or we get the school to implement some green changes with the green fund that we have at our school, or what have you, right? So they can just emphasize those, I found my best friend. I found my wife by being in the student environmental group in college. And we've been together 13 years now because of our shared commitment to this kind of thing. It's an improvement in our lives. It's not changing the world, but it's changed my world, right? So you can show that positive change and empower people to take those kinds of changes. And so that's sort of the next step. You got your story of self. You can start to think, okay, when I tell that, I'm showing my values, and I can maybe listen to meet other people's values. Can I also hook that story of self, though, to climate impacts here and now or in my community? Can I emphasize how engaging in those issues through CCL or another group has helped my life or people's lives around me? And can I creatively empower somebody else to join me on that, in that process, whatever that means, whether that means getting them to come to a meeting, whether that means getting them to make a donation, whether that means getting them to just listen, even if they're not going to agree with you. That's sort of the thing. We can very quickly, I think, do this next one to try to get us to think about that. I think an important thing is to think about, it's hard to sometimes, climate change is so big and so all encompassing, it gets hard to be like, well, how does climate change even affect me? Because it's very slow, it's very big. And so this next poll that I have is meant to help you think about those climate impacts. So Abby, can we fire up that last poll for everyone? So this poll is to make you think about what what impacts of climate change affect you or people you love. Like they got to be people you love or places you love. All right, sorry if folks didn't get a chance to go through that at all. This is merely meant to show, though, that for all of us in the room, and I imagine most of you are in sort of the mid-Atlantic region, a lot of these things are already affecting you or someone you love right now. And one of the most important things in a broader field of climate communication is whenever we're communicating, we're framing information and we're encountering how other people have their information framed. When information fits the frames we have in our head, it fits, we take it in, it sticks with us. When it doesn't fit with our frames, it's easy for us to just drop it out of our head entirely. It just doesn't meet our paradigms or our values. And one of the biggest misconceptions, which is also a big frame, is that climate change is something that's happening in the future. We have lots of problems right now: COVID-19, racial injustice, an economy that's down 20 million jobs or whatever we're down to at this point. Those are very near and immediate, no doubt. Climate change can often seem like it's very distant, even though it's making all of those things worse right now. And so when you tell your climate stories, emphasizing that here and now isn't just a way of like showing that it matters locally. It's also a way of fighting against that framing of climate change as a far future event. It is an event that's happening right now and affecting those you love. And so reframing it to always be like, I'm talking about something in the here and now can help people cognitively understand why you might be even having a conversation about climate change to begin with. So it's really important to make that kind of a thing. And so, yeah, heat waves and cold spells are the one that most of you clicked. And in Maryland, at least last year, we had, one of the hottest summers on record. So if you want to find something that people can connect to, I can connect to the fact that there were like almost every day in July was above 90. On the east in Salisbury, every single day in July was above 90 degrees. It drove our energy bills up, made it miserable to be outside. That's something that everybody can tap into and remember who at least live near me. We're just about out of time, but I let me even see, what's this one? What climate impacts? Yep, so that was our poll. I just want to turn back to Shea Bastida's story here and to just show how, again, she's sort of taking the next step here beyond just the story of self and moving into that story of us and the story of now. If we go back to her story, she talks about where she lives, and then she connects it to not only her small town, but she also makes sure to note that she neighbors Mexico City, which is, like 25 million people. So there's a broad community there. Talks about how that climate shock of a drought and then a flood, often that 1-2 punch that we get with droughts and then floods because of the way droughts affect water retention and such, how that affects. But then importantly, that moved. Then I moved and my family moved to New York and we saw Superstorm Sandy, and I realized it's all the same problem, right? It's this far distant thing. I had a student in a class this past winter term, and she wrote her climate story, and she started with a story about how when she watched a documentary about polar bears when she was in high school, she cried at a sleepover with a friend, and she just cried about that. But she thought it was fundamentally far away from her, but it was very sad. And then her family in the Philippines were hit by 3 typhoons in the span of 3 weeks. and she couldn't get in contact with them, and she couldn't figure out if they were safe or if they had access to clean water and food. And she had a very similar kind of story, having never read Shea Bastida's story, where it's like it's all connected, and showing that connection was the point of her whole story that she wrote in my class. And it's important to show those connections, right? So it's one of the greatest things about stories, we can transcend scale and time. Stories can be epic, stories can be very small. We can say, here's a story about something that's happening in my backyard, but here's how that's connected to this broader global trend, or this struggle that is common to people, whether they live in the Midwest or the Southwest, or, none of it or something. So that's, I think, a promise of stories. And this one, again, is a good example of using those climate impacts in the here and now to also tap into the climate impacts of the future and the world over, when we're trying to connect to people who aren't, living right down the road from us. So I just want to end today to have time for Q&A and to share some resources, but I just wanted to share this quote in the spirit of the theme of today's, or the weekend's conference. And that is that as important as telling your story is and trying to get it to persuade other people to take climate action, it's also important to try to hear other stories. And being right is overrated. Being heard is key. And sometimes you can't see the immediate impacts of that, and it's frustrating. And, when you are in a campaign and you need to get the vote out, or you need to get signatures, or you need to, get votes out of committee, then yeah, no, you're not going to take an hour to soul search with someone about their thing. You don't have to be on, and you don't have to be open and magnanimous at all times of your life. You can be strategic with that. But for the long term in the broad community, being right is overrated. Being heard is key. And so I think that is, and then just two further little questions here. Oh, we are out of time. Who do you want to listen to you? But also think about who you wish could also, and this is hard even grammatically to say for me sometimes, who do you wish, or who do you think wishes you were heard, they were heard by you? I can't even finish it. I'm done. It's 5 o'clock. We're about done. Those of you who want additional resources, I have, I'll just last share screen. I do have, I have different resources broken down by little quick things and medium things and book things. So if you want this document, and you already registered, I will email it out to you right after this. If you didn't register for this workshop, you can drop your email to one of us organizers in the chat, and we'll make sure to get it to you. Thank you all so much. I'm sorry I ran late. I'm happy. I don't know what we are in the schedule right now, but I'm happy to take questions before we're into our next thing. But please, you've all had a long day already, I'm sure. So thank you all so much for your participation, and good luck telling stories. I'm going to